Hey, what's up, Shadow Priest buddies? So, today I want to talk about Shadowlands. And I want this particular video to focus on the absolute must-haves to avoid another 8.0 disaster. I think it's important that we don't really understand Blizzard's deadlines with Shadowlands and how much dev time they're really going to give Shadow. And I know some people want to see a rework. But the thing about a rework is it really justified or even ideal for Blizzard to put in the cost, the extra time involved in that? None of us really know that answer. We can think we do, no matter what side of the coin you're on. Like, we don't know the answer to that. And what I would encourage you to do on that particular topic, because we're going to move on from that, but post on the forums and the Warcraft Priest Discord your point of view, and I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I'm going to link a video that I think is valuable on like sort of the history of WoW, like class and spec design, and how classic WoW handled it in the past and how things evolved through the game into modern WoW that we have today. And I think it's good background to have, like a backstory. Then I think from there, then you can salt and pepper it with your feelings. But I think it helps give some perspective on why things are the way they are. And a lot of it has to do with what is the balance between homogenizing specs to make them viable in all parts of the game versus specs having strengths and weaknesses that draw people together. Like if I'm weak single target, I'm gonna have, you know, someone with me that's good at single target, and then that person that's good at single target is gonna be weak at multi-dot or execute. Things like that. So I would suggest go watching that video. I'm gonna link in the description. And again, encourage the discussion. Bring it to the forums, bring it to Warcraft Priest. But this video, I really want to focus on the absolute minimum that we need to have for Shadowlands launch. Because if we focus too much on the other topic, we might end up with a whole lot of nothing, and we end up with another 8.0. And none of us want that. So, I talked about strengths and weaknesses, and I think that is generally the way the spec design should be, where I'm good at one thing, someone else is good at another. As a team, we're good at both things, and we can do harder content together as a group. There's a balance to that, I understand that, and usually I'd like to think that comes in the form of tuning. Example, Shadow single target in 8.3 is way too damn, you know, low. But that's a mismark on tuning, not necessarily spec design. So, what can we do to kind of make our strengths more desired? It's one way of fixing that issue. I think our execute needs improvement, and maybe getting Shadow Word Death back, and if they tune it, might help in that regard. But what if they consider, a shadow buddy of mine threw this idea at me, and I think it's actually a good one. Two birds with one stone, maybe, with this. Maybe Mastery needs to be giving us some more damage with Execute. If Mastery became more valuable for us through Execute niche, then maybe we wouldn't rely on so much crit. Or haste, for that matter. So maybe that'll help us with our secondary stat balance, making it easier for players to, like, not be crippled when they just happen to throw this item on because it's really all they have. While helping us double down on our strengths, you know, for certain types of content. So, what's the other way that you can tackle this, the strengths and weakness thing? There are specs in the game that need to be adjusted. They are just good at everything. And as long as that's true, then everyone's going to want to be the same. And I don't think the answer is to have all of us be the same. I think that that takes fun out of the game, and then it just becomes a point where you pick your spec based on aesthetic, as opposed to having your niche and being interesting and cool in your own unique way and getting a special gameplay experience from that spec. So this is why you'll see me talk about CDs being not the answer, burst, priority damage. Other specs already do that well. What I think is wrong is they gridded everything. They have utility, kicks, everybody. There's a point at which maybe Shadow's not the one that is the problem, but some of these other specs are still homogenized from the past, and Blizzard hasn't yet fixed them. So I'm going to add that to the list, even though it's not a Shadow thing, that they look at some of those other parts of the game, or the other specs, rather. So, talking about that a little bit further, let's talk about Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus has a bias, in a very big way, to melee. So we can clamor, hey, I want an interrupt on 12-second CD, and I want a stun. They just took our stun away. They took away Mind Bomb. We used to have that in Legion. I don't think that was the wrong call. I think the problem with Mythic Plus in particular, and different specs being viable or desired, is Mythic Plus needs to evolve. It's a relatively new part of the game, and I would like to see in Shadowlands that they start designing dungeons where they're more like how raids are utilizing strengths and weaknesses. So the spec should have them, and the design should call for them, or at least give a team an edge. You should have an edge in a particular dungeon or two, or three, or maybe all of them, where a massive spell was helpful. Because, hey, you got a Resto Druid, right? We would bring a Holy Priest. You know, we're gonna have a Resto Druid. So yeah, let's bring the Shadow. They have a massive spell. That's like one example I could think of. We could go on and on, but they need to, through the design of the dungeon, bring in more of those things. Maybe some of the trash mobs need to be more anti-melee. I know the melee are going to hate me for that, but maybe they're going to be able to clear it, but it's going to be a little bit more tedious if you stack melee. Maybe you have to split your DPS, have at least one range player, so that that particular mob can be hit from afar, and your melee kind of can't do as much for that particular pull. That could solve some of the stacking of melee going on in Mythic Plus. These are just very small examples. But I believe that's a flaw in Mythic Plus design, not a flaw in Shadow's design. Again, an area that just needs to evolve, in my opinion. So let's talk about pacing. So Shadow's design is actually very much in sync with the story of Shadow, at least according to a current version of it that we have today, which is from Legion. Legion is when it came out. So we are a priest that is fighting, going insane. We're fighting insanity. And to go with that, we have haste-driven systems that, as voidform progresses, we're pressured to fight insanity through increasing haste, and that plays into the fantasy of the spec. And I do think it helps the fantasy to be believable. At least more than other specs in the game, in my opinion. So you can get caught up in the speed of the spec, the fantasy, and it also it has an adrenaline loop, and that's why I'm addicted to it for sure. So what happens in 8.0, or happened in 8.0, and even up through 8.1, it was too slow for the design to work. And I actually think that a lot of people agree about this, that the design requires the speed. So if that's true, we need to keep the pacing of the spec protected from secondary stat starvation. And secondary stats, I'm going to go into that in a little bit. what's happening with secondary stats in the game, and that needs to be fixed game-wide. But after that, there's shadow-specific things that also need to get looked at. And 8.2 and 8.3, everything was fixed from a gameplay standpoint. Like, Shadow was fun again. New people are re-rolling into Shadow Priest, and they love it. Like, I talk to these people, like, they're like, wow, Shadow's so fun, you know? They played in 8.2 and 8.3, right? Or they're older people from before in Legion. That didn't happen in 8.0 and 8.1. Why? Because it didn't have that synergy going on. And again, I'm going to get into secondary stats and what's going on with that. That's a BFA problem. But if they fix that foundation, Shadow needs protection from requiring loot for gameplay. Like, we shouldn't need a bunch of haste in our gear to enjoy the spec for what it's meant to be. So what can we do what can we suggest to make sure that that pacing is there on launch? When they ship the product to us, we shouldn't lose all the fun, right? Because I don't want to quit the game for a year and come back. Because that's just not how an MMO works. So I don't want to suffer for a year. It'd be miserable. So one of the things we can do, and one of the things they can look into doing, is bring Lingering Insanity baseline, and when they do that, tune it in a way, if you just cut copy paste, it's probably going to be too strong. Tune it in a way that makes sense, and that tuning of LI should be based around whatever the secondary stat strategy is for Shadowlands. So they need to be done together and not in a silo at Blizzard. And I think the siloing that they did in BFA is why we got quadruple nerfed with haste, and that's why it was so ridiculously slow. Also, the other point with pacing is we should have a nice contrast between being out of void form and throughout void form. We should feel that haste increasing, because again, I talked about how it plays into the feedback of the spec and makes it believable and gets you caught up in it and makes it actually really fun to play. So if we add a little bit more haste to void form, especially the tail end of it, that might also help us counter the loss we're going to have from COI. Right now, all the COI, we're getting a lot of damage when we exit void form. When that goes away in Shadowlands, we're going to need compensation for that. And I think the answer is to inject a little bit more haste into late void form. I've done some numbers on GCD, and I did this back in the BFA beta. I did a lot of testing with a brand new tune. Again, this is beta of BFA, and I contrasted it to the Legion, my Legion character, and later on I copied my character to the client of BFA and compared all three of those things. And I knew that BFA was going to have a problem with secondary stats. But I did do some benchmarking, because I'm like, you know, we're going to lose access to Legion, and we're going to forget over time what worked, what made sense. Shadow played very fast. I mean, we played in Legion as if we had lust almost the entire time. And I would love to see us have that again, but that's not... I know that I'm crazy for asking or wishing for that. So what do I benchmarked some numbers that... What was the bare minimum that I felt like maybe we could have and still work for the, you know, the bulk of the player base and still allow it to be fun? So the benchmarking I did is a 1 second GCD out of void form, and getting into at least like a 0.85 or 0.80 GCD towards the end of void form. And again, we'll have that contrast, and again play into that believability. Let's talk about secondary stats and what BFA I think really messed up with. So 8.0 was very, very, very slow. Not just for Shadow Priest, but also the rest of the game. I think Shadow Priest is a lot more sensitive to it, and maybe that's why I feel like I have a deep appreciation for this problem. But it's definitely game-wide, for sure. So if we look at these charts, I drew on the left-hand side BFA. And BFA has, in my opinion, a severe slowdown of the game and secondary stat starvation. I think in total stats and maybe even the scaling itself. I don't know if people remember leveling from Legion to BFA. You'd get to about 116, and the BFA scaling started to hit your character. So what Blizzard's trying to do is reel back that power from Legion to allow you places to grow over the course of BFA. It needs to happen, like, they're not wrong in doing this, and they do it every expansion. But Legion had such a high, and BFA had such a low, it was incredibly severe. So on the left-hand side, I drew a concept art. This is concept art. This is not actually accurate, but this is my feeling on how it went. We went a full year in the 2-year cycle of the expansion, starving of secondary stats. That's 8.0 and that's 8.1. We got a little bit, so I did show an increase there. But we really didn't get any true fixes for this issue until 8.2 and 8.3. I think it's very possible Blizzard already learned this lesson, and I think 8.2 designs and even the corruption gear designs having secondary stats on it is a way of injecting secondary stats back into the game to kind of fix the imbalance that 8.0 and 8.1 had with it. So what it meant is a long time of not so fun specs to play, Shadow suffering the most from this, and I think they injected us with a lot of 8.1 changes DPS-wise to not really address some of the core problems related to secondaries. And for some people it worked or got their minds off it because at least our DPS was good, right? But I remember doing Jaina, and that shit wasn't fun. Like, I still felt like I was in some kind of mud back then, and I have the VODs to go back and look and watch it. I have a GCD weak aura, and I can tell. Like, I can tell in the GCDs and I can tell in the weak aura that the game was still too slow on Jaina as well. I'm a tough customer when it comes to this. I like the speed of the game, I like the speed of Shadow and Legion, so if anyone's going to notice this threshold, it's going to be me. But it doesn't mean that every player is going to feel it at all or notice it as much, and it might even be subconscious. It could just be, I'm so distracted with the fight and the DPS meters that you don't really notice it, but I promise you it was still there. And I promise you people were getting kind of bored with the game or not happy with how things played, and they didn't necessarily understand why. I'm convinced it's secondary stat related, and the GCD itself. Not just things going on to GCD, but also the total speed of the GCD and how it turns. So towards the end of the tier, which is 8.2 and 8.3, we're injected with secondary stats. So we had a huge correction in the back half of BFA. Obviously we can't do this again. In Shadowlands, we can't do this. We should not be unhappy with our gameplay, game-wide, regardless of what spec you play, for a year. I mean, that's absurd. That almost encourages you to just walk away from the game for a year and come back in a year. That's ridiculous. It's an MMO. We should be able to stick with it the entire time and not walk away from the game. It's anti-MMO mentality. So on the right-hand side, I drew a picture on how, from a conceptual standpoint, how I think secondary stats should be. I think it should be a higher starting point. And I think there needs to be a slower slope. But the slope, I still think, needs to be there. So, if the slope is still there, we should still be able to gradually feel more and more power as the expansion progresses. But it should be subtle. Very, very slow and very, very gradual. Because you're trying to get from release to 2 years later and accomplish all the same things, but without making a full year of the expansion not fun to play. So hopefully Again, 8.2 and 8.3 systems might indicate Blizzard understand this already and acknowledge the problem, but in case they don't, I wanted to document it. And yes, I documented all of this in the BFA beta and saw it coming a mile away, and I wish I could pull up forum posts from then, but getting to those forums is I couldn't even get them on the archives. Like, they're just very, very hard to find, and I don't know if you can actually get them. Maybe intended, I don't know. Alright. So what else? I think with Shadowlands, trying to get back into the class identity. We already know we're getting Shadow Word Death back, so we're not going to spend any time really talking about that too much. But I think Power Infusion needs to come back. And it needs to come back for all 3 specs. And I believe if we get Power Infusion back, it's going to do a couple of things. I think it can supplement, thinking about Nighthold gameplay a little bit, because it's very similar to 8.2 gameplay and therefore 8.3 gameplay, which I also find fun in general. So Power Infusion can take the place of Lucid. And what's actually funny about thinking that way is Power Infusion also had like that light effect that Lucid has. Like, you could contrast the bright light against your Shadow Priest. So it even had that aesthetic that was really cool. And Lucid kind of gave us that. That's not why I like Lucid, by the way. But it's another cool aside, or another little side benefit. So Power Infusion should come back. In case you don't know what that is, it was like a haste generated CD. It was a very short CD. So I'd like to see that come back, and it should be all pre-specs. You know, Discipline and Holy should also have it. And it's a baseline spell. Or CD, rather. So for talents, I mentioned moving Li to baseline. So if we're going to lose Li in the talent row, I don't want to make a rigid request here. I'm sure Blizzard might already have other ideas on what they want to do with our talent tree, but just in case, maybe I want to throw this idea in there. I really would like to see a Cephas Secret style legendary effect as a talent. The way that it worked is, if you silence something, purged or whatever, you could get a haste proc from that action. It had lots of uses in gameplay that didn't involve having an extra button, and I think it was sort of like the coolest thing in that regard. I also kind of miss it in Mythic Plus, because you could, on the opener of a new trash pack, you could throw up a silence or a stun or whatever and proc it, and now you have a big burst of haste similar to Lust, where you can get all your dots out really quickly. So I do think they should consider maybe giving us something along those lines. And honestly, I think it's cool because it encourages players to use their purges and their dispels more frequently. And it even encourages them to keybind it in case they don't. So I think it's a win-win to have stuff like that in the game. And it kind of encourages people to make good habits and use their toolkit. Maybe I'm talking from experience, maybe. The other thing is, we're going to need something for Shadow Word Death coming out. That's going baseline again, so we're going to have a empty talent there. That part of the talent row needs to be single target oriented, and it either needs something for single target, maybe even doubling down on some of our execute would be nice to see. Talking about earlier, how do we get Shadow to be, you know, kind of double down on our strengths? I think multi-dot already kind of covered. Some of that execute might be nice to have that buff there through that talent row as an option. Maybe the boss is super difficult and that's the way to go. Maybe that would have been the play on Azoth, I don't know. We'll never know because we don't have that option. So the other thing is Surrender to Madness. So Surrender needs its own video. But for now, I'm going to say I think the Surrender talent should still exist in the game. I don't think every talent we have needs to be viable for the hardest of content. I'd like to see Surrender exist for fun. And again, got to go deeper in on that topic in another video. Maybe I'll find time for it, maybe I never make it, but I actually had fun hitting 100 stacks in Borealis on dummies. Like, one of my top 5 memories of BFA was Surrender to Madness target dummies. Yeah. So I think it should stay in the game. I think we just need to find, you know, how it should exist in the game, and I think having those cool things makes the game interesting, just because they exist. The last thing is buttons. Shadow, if we get Power Infusion back and Shadow Word Death, and we're going to have a Covenant ability, one of those will overlap with the Essence keybind that we have now, because it gets swapped with maybe the Covenant ability, but there's definitely a few more spells that we're getting. I think we might need to ask Blizzard to look into Mindseer again and see if there's some new solution between Mindseer and Mindflay to get rid of one of those buttons, because I have a feeling there's some players that are going to run out of keybinds. I think I'm in that situation, or I might end up in that situation myself, where now I'm on keybinds I really don't freaking like doing. Like, never mind other players that are just already maxed out. I'm not a big advocate for pruning, but I think in Shadow's case we have a lot of shit. I think we have a lot of stuff. And if we had to choose between having Mindseer or Shadow Word Death baseline, what would you rather have? I'd rather have freaking Shadow Word Death. Or Power Infusion. Like, those are worth the bloat of our buttons. Mindseer, I'm not really sold. I'd like to see a creative solution on that from Blizzard, possibly. At the very least, wanted to mention it. So, how do we not have another, how do you say, BFA launch? Let's not have another 8.0. I don't think, for those of us that stuck around for the entirety of BFA, I would say our patience is thin, even dedicated players like myself. And for those that people that have left, definitely I think always look to come back and look for the fixes. Some of these topics I have up here are not just Shadow related. They're related to 8.0 and the secondary stat thing. But let's go through them, recap them real quick. So, for Shadow Priest, they really need to buff our strengths. And I think our multi-dot strength is okay, and I think they've been doing a good job at making that strong for us. And we should be king at that. I do believe that. We don't have the raid utility that Warlocks have, so yeah, I think that needs to be a thing. In contrast to that, in order for Shadow to have a place among other specs in the game, they need to have other specs really looked at in strengths and weakness, and make sure that it makes sense across the game, and we don't have everybody have everything. Otherwise, everyone just be a fire mage and a warlock. The next thing is increase secondary stats at launch, and again, making sure that the gradual increase over the expansion is gradual and not starvation or like feast to famine. Like, it shouldn't be famine to feast. It needs to be a little bit more where it makes sense for the players, that we're not jerked around and all of a sudden hate everything and don't know why. For Shadow, and again, they need to figure out secondary stats before they get into Shadow, because that's sort of the baseline of the game. Then Shadow's baseline needs to get looked at. We should not need to be decked out in crit haste gear from the raid, Mythic gear, to enjoy the spec's gameplay. I think everyone should be able to enjoy the spec the way it's meant to be played, and I think some of those increases can come from gear, but not at the severity that it is right now. So baseline pacing, I've done the math on this. This is an opinion, but I really believe it's true. Shadow's design feels correct at approximately 1 second exact GCD outside of voidform, and towards the end of our voidform, getting into the 0.85 GCD. When we're lusted, it's 0.75, so you can still feel the power of lust. Something like that. I mean, I'm always gonna want that shit faster. Like, that's the minimum. If Blizzard thinks we can have more, give me more. But the contrast is important. And it needs to have contrast between out of void form and the end of void form. Power infusion should be baseline for all pre-specs. I think this should be obvious and not really a difficult thing to expect. And talents, if we go with any of the recommendations that I went through, could a Cephas-like thing be added for us? I really think I'd like to see it. I don't know if they're willing to do that, but I really would like to. And if, for Shadow or Death talent row, we're going to need something to plug that hole there, and I think it needs to be a talent related to single target and or our execute single target. Buttons need to be kind of looked at. Getting back Power Infusion, and if we got back, and we're definitely getting back Shadow or Death, I worry about most players, maybe even myself included here, am I going to start running out of keybinds that I actually enjoy pressing? Like, that's another thing. So this is the boiled down must-haves in my opinion. Like, I believe these are required topics to cover going into Shadowlands. No fluff, no extra bullshit. This is the mandatory list, in my opinion. Let me know if you guys agree. Feel free to add your comments in the comments section of this video. Let's try to keep this focused on what little things, lightweight things, can we ask for. Because I think if we keep it lightweight, we might actually get it. If you ask for everything, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, personally. Let's shoot for something more achievable. And this is what I believe is achievable, and I also believe it would make the most people happy overall. Maybe I'm wrong, that's just my opinion. I would be happy. I know some other people that I talk to would be happy. That this would be enough. Sure, there's always a million other things that we could ask for. So that's gonna be it for now. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully I give you stuff to think about. And again, a reminder to check out the description. I'll link you a video that I think is really worth watching. It's definitely good food for the brain, if you will. And I know myself really enjoyed just listening to this guy talk about classic WoW and versus modern WoW, and I do think there's definitely perspective there that anyone can gain from a different point of view than kind of the stuff we're used to dealing with on a day in, day out basis. So until next time, later.